Um, Thank you, Verity, for remembering to record. Just some housekeeping rules, which I shall put on the screen now, for everybody. And also just to note to say as well, if anyone is interested in joining our wonderful committee, I'm not biased, I promise, but our wonderful committee, we have a few different vacancies that are available. They're listed at the bottom, so please do get in touch with me if you are interested in any of them. So I shall stop sharing my screen now. And I've got I'll say brief intro for Brian. So for Professor Brian Dolan, who is going to be presenting and giving us this talk today. So for those who've had the pleasure of interacting with Brian, you'll know that we could honestly spend this whole hour talking about how wonderful he is and all of his accomplishments. So as I said, I'll keep this as brief as I can. So Brian has extensive clinical experience in emergency and mental health nursing in the NHS. He holds multiple full and honorary professorship roles at universities such as the University of Salford in Manchester, Coventry University, and Bonn University as well. He is the author slash editor of 8 books and counting. And he is the director of Health Service 360, through which he has created the global social movements hashtag last 1000 days, which looks at valuing patients' time, and the hashtag NPJ paralysis movement to encourage patients to get up, dressed, and moving to reduce their risk of deconditioning whilst in hospital. He is also the most wonderful storyteller too, which again will be evident, I'm sure, by the end of his talk. And Brian was also voted one of the 20 most influential people in the 70-year history, excuse me, of the NHS in 2018 and in the Queen's 2019 New Year's Honours List, and was awarded an OBE for services to nursing and emergency care. And on top of all of that, Brian is the first nurse to become honorary president of Agile, and we are truly, truly thankful to have him in our corner. So again, you'll see why very shortly. So without further ado, I shall hand over, and a massive welcome and thank you to Brian.
Thank you. The word that goes through my head whenever I hear is obituary. It's just so so thank you very much for that. Can I tell you all some news as well, since you're all here and we're among friends? Next, Professor Linda Holt, she's my business partner. She's an amazing, amazing woman. So she's all the brains of all this. So if you like the slide deck, she's designed all that. But the two of us are going to be made Freemen of the City of London next week. And the thing with it is it means because one of my sisters has kind of went up online and looked at it up. Well, what's it mean? As to the delivery of nurses, so it's one of the guilds, one of the new guilds is through that. And it's kind of like for our services to nursing. But apparently we can walk a sheep or a cow across London Bridge. Um, and I can't remember the other bits, but one of my favorite bits is that if I ever get drunk and I'm around London, in the City of London police will bundle me into a cab to get me home. And I think that's great, or as my sister Marion puts it, so much more useful and practical than an OBE. So, and in many ways, these are all the stories. This is what I think, it's very generous to say about storytelling, but I think there's something also, there's a strong cultural element to storytelling. And I think it was, of all people, um, Graham Norton. He was being interviewed a couple of weeks ago in America about his new book. He's actually a lovely storyteller himself, very great writer. Loved it, Frankie, his new book. And he said there's something about, he said, and he's lived in England for like for 30 odd years now. And what he notices is that English people, as he describes it, need to know somebody. Irish people don't need to know any of it at all. It doesn't really matter. It's actually just the storytelling that is so, so very important. But I would posit that it's actually the stories. It's the truth doesn't matter. I'm not even going to try and go there about America. Let's just not do that tonight for our own well-being. It's only 155 weeks and one way to go. We're grand. But it's the stories really make the biggest difference when it comes to embedding change in a system. It's all in the story we tell. And actually, when I say about England and I talk about Ireland, you know, Rianne, proud British, proud Sierra Leonean heritage and background, and also wrote the co-authored, or you led the team that has developed the first Sierra Leonean British dictionary. Am I said that right? It is,
Yeah,
isn't it?
yeah, exactly. Our
Incredible.
language is Creole, so it
Extraordinary.
was the first bilingual dual dictionary that was created, the biggest as well.
Still absolute respect.
Thank you.
And if you think about it, though, countries, they're just a story. It's a story. That's all it is. It's a story we tell ourselves of where we are from, and it means that who we are. Do you remember that thing that we used to call cash? Cash is simply a story. It's symbolically something, those things we used to hold in our hand. And the story is this is worth something, but it's only a piece of paper. But actually, what it is a story. Our sense of self, our sense of country, our sense of culture, our sense of monetary value in terms of exchanging of currency, all of these things are simply stories. And when we want to embed change, it is absolutely true that it's, hearts and minds in that order for a reason. We connect through story, but the story starts with connecting with people's hearts. And how stories can help embed changes? First of all, they hold our attention. There's something we as a species are very, very, attracted to story. It matters to us, and there's nothing, and if you, those of us who are young enough to like, remember as kids or having kids or whatever it may be, you know, you couldn't finish a story halfway through. You had to go to, and so much so, our brains are wired to finding what happens. How many of you watched a program where you think, well, that was rubbish because it didn't feel like it ended anyway? So we need to have stories because they grab us. Stories are also very simple to understand. And circling back to the construct of what it means, I see there's Claire, there's Blohin, there's others like I'm sure from Ireland. We know what that is. If you are English or Scottish or wherever you may be from, you know what that means. But the most successful stories are simple ones. Although I'm best perhaps known for the NPJ paralysis campaign, and I'm convinced it'll be on my gravestone, which is why I've recently decided to get buried at sea. But if you think about the last 1,000 days, it's just so simple to understand because if you had 1,000 days left to live, how many would you choose to spend in hospital? Last night I spent it at New College, Oxford. I was fortunate enough to do a master's in educational research methodology in the 90s in in Oxford. And I was invited as with the bursar as a guest. Talked about us, and this extraordinary philosopher. We got talking, and he's talking about the last 1,000 days, and think about it. Somebody who's got nothing, in many respects, to do with our disciplines in healthcare, no background of it, completely got it because a simple day. And he said, "Well, what does it mean?" I said, "Well, it's if you had 1,000 days left to live, how many would you choose to spend in hospital?" He said, "Well, none, of course. It's about stories, making them simple. They also have to be memorable." So, because they're lovely, I had a breakfast there this morning with Olda, and somebody mentioned it because he had talked about it. And I think that's how we transfer. They're kind of viral in that respect. Because if they're really easy, they will be sticky. If it's over, as we will see, if it's over engineered, they get confusing. So stories have to be something that's memorable, that stands out. How many times have you watched an ad? You're telling your mates about the ad, you think, I've no idea what they were selling. It's just brilliant. And we've all had that experience of ads. And they're
Brian,
perfect. Yes, please do.
so sorry to interrupt.
No, no, please do.
The screen's flashing quite a lot. I'm not sure if you need to stop sharing and then reshare. But
Yes, I
people are
can. I
saying the
can do that.
slides are
I
like flashing on and off.
the screen's just flashing on and off altogether.
Just the slides are kind of flashing,
How
but
bizarre.
not, yeah.
That kind of feels vaguely rude.
Yeah,
Let's just try that.
looks better.
I've also put I think I know I've put my lampshade down a bit, so I suspect the Mac was trying to to deal with it.
Just, yeah, thank you.
No, no,
Sorry.
that's all. No, no, you're absolutely grand, Verity. No, that's up to you. Thank you for doing so. And for those of you who now need an ophthalmic appointment, my apologies for that. So, but stories are persuasive. I don't think we need to over-engineer. And that's from Carol Hatcher. That was in 2016, that piece of work. But when you're looking to change things, you have to realize change isn't big. Change starts really, really small. And it's usually one person and then another and then another, and they make a stand and they create a small thing which becomes a big thing. And although you don't hear so much about her, and there's a whole conversation about that offline in the sense about it, but one young then 16-year-old decided not to go to school on Fridays. She sat outside her school. Her dad actually sat with her for a while. And then she said, why bother going to school anymore if we're going to have if we have a planet that's on fire? And it was such a simple, persuasive story. Other kids started not going to school, and we saw, and in fact, it was accelerating and growing and growing. And then obviously we saw beginning of in the spring of northern spring of 2020, COVID struck. But that was something that was gaining substantial momentum, and it was doing so because what Greta Thunberg did was able to persuade people, and particularly younger people, to take it much, much more serious because she cut through decades of dense science to something that was simple. And that's how change happens. First one, then another, then another. And you look at this 42-year-old seamstress, this introvert called Rosa Parks, who on the 1st of December 1955 got on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and a few stops beyond the James Blake, the bus driver, told her to move to the back of the bus. Why? For the simple reason this woman was black. Had she been from the Indian subcontinent? Had she been from Southeast Asia? Had she been from South America? It was about the color of her skin. But Rosa Parks, it wasn't that that was her first rodeo with standing up. She was a lifelong activist for black, and particularly black women's rights. But on this particularly wet, dirty night, she said no. And James Blake, who was a racist's racist, previously, they used to send people to the back, black people to the back of the bus. They wouldn't let them go into the front of the bus. It was discretionary, but they usually said go to the back. So he got her to get off the bus, out the front door, go back to the back door. And as she was getting onto the back door, he closed the doors and they just sped off, in the dirty night, wet night. And that was the kind of style that this man had. So the fact that she stood up to him, or in a literal sense, sat down, he had her arrested. And within, an hour or so of her being arrested and being put in the Montgomery County Jail, there was hundreds of people. Where she sat down, there was 100 people marching. And one of those who got involved very early on was a young Black Baptist minister called Dr. Martin Luther King. And where she sat down, hundreds marched. And then on the 28th of August, on the 1963, hundreds of thousands marched. And the power of it was her action. She lit the spark of the civil rights movement. And her strength was acknowledging that she knew what was going to happen. One of the things that they would do to young activists is, they weren't able to go to milk bars, I think they called them, what we would think of as coffee shops. But to desensitize them from the racial abuse that they would get going into a white-only milk bar, they set up milk bars, they built them, and then these black activists would hurl abuse at these teenagers. They would pour milkshakes on top of them, so they would be desensitized. It wouldn't come as a shock to them when this thing actually happened to them. You think about the courage, but it was also about a story which was about dignity and civil rights and everyone being equal under God. That's what it was connected with. And Dr. King, the right person, the right place, the right time. And if you ever, it's honestly, it is worth your while. If you've never listened to it, you can find it on YouTube. Go and listen to Dr. King's speech. Because early on, or midway through that speech, he had done what was a kind of almost pedestrian speech he had written. But the thing is, one of the jazz singers from behind him said, "Tell them about the dream, Martin. Tell them about the dream." And that's when he went off on this famous riff, where he talked when he dreamt of a day when his four black daughters would play with four white children, and they would judge not on the color of their skin, but on the content of their character. When the sons of slaves and the sons of slave owners would sit down around a table and break bread together. Because remember, it was barely 70, 80 years since the end of slavery. It was in some people's lifetimes. This was still fresh to people. In the same way, anyone who was involved in the Second World War, they're in their 90s and early hundreds, but it is still part of the cultural linked story of what Great Britain is to itself. But he also talked elsewhere of the arc of history is long but bends towards justice. This is what he didn't do. What Dr. King, while he talked about his dream and his hopes and his ambitions, you know, 40% of the people who were there that day, they weren't black, they were white. They were from the Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia. They were from Latin America. They were from, they were Native Americans. They were from all places because the thing is, the power of the story of civil rights was they believed what he believed. And if you believe somebody, if you believe their story, you will follow them. But what he didn't do, he didn't go up and say, "Now, listen, I've got great news for you all. I've got a fantastic project plan. There's a great Gantt chart. I've got spreadsheets. And I'm now going to read the 40-page strategy." What do you think would have happened? It would have left them stone cold. I had the good fortune of working in Canterbury, New Zealand for quite a number of years. And the whole of the strategy of the Canterbury health system, by demonstrably one of the finest health systems in the world, was a picture. It was quite literally a picture of a house with a woman outside. We called her Agnes. We created a character. We created a story of how do we value Agnes's time as the most important currency in healthcare. But not only that, at the edge of those concentric circles, you had her home, the primary care, community care, secondary care. The edge was those hospitals. Because too often hospitals are a cathedral of technocure, which we believe, the story we tell ourselves in health is that they are at the epicenter of what healthcare is about. And what a part of our collective storytelling needs to shift to, there is plenty of beds in a health system, but they're all in people's homes. See what he talked about, his dream, his ambition. But so often when people sell things, products, I've got an LG screen here beside me. And how would LG sell their screen? They would say, well, we've got a brand new screen. It's very thin, it's very light, great crisp pictures. How we've done it, we've got some clever genius engineers in South Korea. I think it's LG, isn't it? Would you like to buy one? And I'd say, well, I could get a Sony, I could get a Panasonic, I could get it. Doesn't bother me. Doesn't connect at all. You see, the what and the how are to do with our logic. Is the, if you will, the frontal cortex. But that's not how we connect to story. We connect to story viscerally. And Simon Sinek, again, his TED talk, I think the last time I looked, is about 45, 50 million views now. Is we don't even have language, but we say, "Ah, this doesn't feel right," or "I feel this." We don't even have words. But what we can do is when something feels okay, we believe in it. And the way Apple, as we know, sells their products, they don't talk about what, they start with why. We believe in challenging the status quo. We believe that you could have 1,000 songs in your pocket. We believe in thinking differently. How? Because we've got great engineers in Cupertino, California, who produce iPhones and, would you like to buy one? And people will queue at midnight for one of these that they could go in off the street a week later and buy it off the street. But they'll queue because if people believe what you believe, if they believe the story, they will follow you. And it is the why, when it comes to embedding change, it is the why that builds engagement and cooperation. As Nietzsche said, people will put up with any what if they have a good why. And if you look in military history, the superpowers only win about 40% of the time. You know, Britain, America, they could be in Vietnam, they could be in Afghanistan for another 100 years, but they would never win for the simple reason that people see it beyond them as individuals to the story that is about their culture, their country, and what it is. It's the strength of the why that people literally, sadly, sacrifice themselves for the bigger story. If you think about the history of the military, it's very much about we're doing this, we work together. And rather darkly, I was listening to a podcast about why did Germany, because this being the 80th week of the release of Auschwitz, and why were Nazis doing this? And there was one group, and they were police, basically police or training police, and they all ended up in the force, in the SS and stuff like that. And they would go out and they'd be shooting civilians. And what was mattered more when they interviewed, there was 100 interviews done. What they discovered, but being a part of a team was a bigger why than what and sadly were a terrible crimes against humanity, because they had the why, and that case the why was the team. So we ever why would they do this? Because about being a team member mattered so much. I'm still processing that as when I've heard it, but it just makes sense now. But when you think of things that making sense, as we under communicate by a factor of 10. Oh, I sent an email, we called a meeting, and they're still not doing it. Why? Because you cannot over communicate. And questions don't mean resistance. Questions often mean people are processing, and we underestimate the role of fear in the story. What goes wrong? What will happen to my PIN number? What about my team? What about my patients? What about, and the smart communicators are answering questions even before they are forming. But the other great storytellers is they allow the space for people to process the story as it emerges. So they give time for people to internalize it rather than going at 100 miles an hour. But it's also the power of giving people permission. Giving people permission is about saying, I trust in you, and the story that you're telling yourself aligns with what we all want. Go ahead. And when you have a high trust, see, a team isn't a team without trust. Otherwise, it's just a group of randoms who are co-located. Real leadership are about people who are connected to why they're going to do what they're going to do, and it gives them permission to fix it. I think one of the many reasons why Canterbury was such a great health system was the executive leadership. They wouldn't give answers. They would just ask really great questions and let people work it out. If you trust people, and in this case, trust the clinicians, they will come up with the solutions. But it takes time. Trust comes in on a turtle and it leaves on a horse. You have to build it up. And in many respects, you're never off duty for a heartbeat if you're in a role that involves leadership, because you can break that trust so easily. And a bit like a plate, you can glue it as much as you like, but it'll always have the cracks. And here's a story of this is the shadow of K2. It's an almost triangular. It's the second highest mountain, quite a lot harder to get to than Everest. But until recently, I think the mortality rate of this mountain was something in the region of 24%. But most of those deaths occurred when people were going down the mountain. And why is it relevant to this? Because sometimes when people believe the story they've conquered something, the deaths occurred because they thought they'd already made it, they'd solved it, they'd fixed it, they'd climbed it, and they became complacent. And a very common question, I was having this conversation with a director of nursing only the other day, yesterday, I think. And it's about what happens, why is change hard to sustain? And there's a couple of reasons, I think. 70% of change efforts fail. Look at John Cotter's work from 1996, and it's been stood the test of time. 70% fail, flat out fail. 25% go better or not so well. You know, they're somewhere in the middle. And that's where I put NPJ paralysis, by the way. You know, it's flying in some places, not so much on others. But only 5% of real change succeeds. And the reason is too often we're so focused on Gantt charts and project planning and committee meetings instead of, that's about 80%. And about 20% is motivating, inspiring, listening, telling stories, listening to stories, giving permission. And those percentages should be exactly the opposite to each other. Should be the 80% of all that chance to tell. And the other reason I think is this, is that when the lens of leaders move on to the next challenge they are facing, unless that story is deeply embedded in the team, if you like, the business as usual, then it starts to slip away because you have to keep telling stories. Classics are classics for a reason because they tell a story which resonates sometimes across thousands of years. You see, one of the things we've got to realize in terms of telling stories is there is no risk and there is no safe. What we simply have with our patients is a lower risk and safer. And I know as physiotherapists, you know, you all know that we should ban the phrase back to baseline. How do you start to even entertain the thought of measuring that meaningfully in a hospital setting? And you know, a better question than is the patient safe for discharge is sometimes are they safe for admission? There's brand new research has just come out of the organization for, is it organization? The Office of National Statistics. The sample size is 6.7 million. It was done over about 13 months, up to April 23, I believe. 6.7 million. And what they have found is if you enter an emergency department, by the time you have been there for 12 hours and more, your mortality rate at 30 days is more than twice as high as if you had got in much, much faster within an hour or so. So it is a harm event. But a conversation was having some folk yesterday about deconditioning, or quite recently, more accurately, is about can we start looking at deconditioning in the front door? Because if people are waiting now 3, 4, 5 days in extremis, yes, they will decondition, but you can't fix it from the front door. You have to work at the back and you have to take a whole system. And too often it's all about seeing as a hospital story. We need to recalibrate the stories that we are telling because the story we're telling is clearly not working for anyone. And there's a great Roy Lilly, if you Google him or look up, he's got this brilliant blog. He does it twice a week. And he just says, you know, just start with the patient and work backwards because too often the story we tell ourselves is, oh, look at all these new skills we've got. We can help patients instead of what does the patient need and how do we design our jobs and our roles and our effectiveness and start small. The brain is a funny old thing. If you start something, the brain really gets quite across about not finishing it. There is a name for it and it's based on some restaurant servers. And what they did is they asked them, they were taking all these orders and they might have like 7 or 8 or 9 people they were serving. And they knew which plates, where the plates for the food go and who got everything. And then about 5 or 6 minutes later, they'd ask them, oh, so what was that order? And they'd say, I don't know, I've finished it, it's done. Because the brain would have done with it, it had dealt with it, it was fixed, it's out of their heads. When if it's something that's not finished, and let's use the example, stick with the example of the servers, one of them is waiting because their meal hasn't fully cooked, it'll still be there annoying them. So when we start something, we are by as I said, it ties into stories. We want to finish it. And you know, sometimes the best way to get something finished is start. That's too often and I'm guilty of this, by the way, with the deconditioning book. Too often you're so busy thinking about the outcome, you forget that if you start with the process. So over the last week or so, I've been really, really buckling down into the breakdown of all the tiny, tiny steps it will take to get that book out by the summer. And that's what's going to happen. Let's start it. Remember, many of you will have seen this, but if you need reasons why all this stuff matters, because patience time is the most important currency in health and social care. And while our time is busy and important, our patients' time is sacred. 48% of people over the age of 85 will die within a year of a hospital admission. And it circles back to the last 1,000 days, because if you had 1,000 days left to live, how many would you choose to spend in hospital? And each, I think, of these 3 points, they're compelling, they are persuasive, they have a story within them. Because these are the stories about not just us, but those we love as well. But the challenge we face is sometimes we get so exercised in other people's actions, behaviors, things we have no control over. I think about America, we're all having this collective global freakout. There's not a lot we can do. We need to mind ourselves and focus on our attitudes, our interactions, the things we have. And it's worth, take a photograph if you like, but it is worth actually taking the time to write this thing down, because it is good for your own well-being, because the story changes to, actually, I can't do all of that, but I can do something about this. And that shifts the story away from disempowerment and incapability to do anything to, it may be small, but it matters. Because wisdom is knowing where do you put your efforts and energy, as opposed to the scattergun approach of trying to do all things all the time and just being exhausted. So a question you need to reflect on is, who do you need to influence? And the people you may need to influence may not be those in the positions of power, because the ward clerk, if you work in a hospital setting, may be by far the most influential person. So it's not always obvious that the influence is, if you think status is about influence, it isn't. It's about loose connections are more effective than very, very strong ones. But we also need to remember that the NHS doesn't have one culture. Your organization doesn't have one culture. What we all do is we work in one system, but within it, there's 1,000 different villages, each with their own stories. And there's not one of us who won't have had the experience as students, whatever our backgrounds, where you go from one ward to another ward, 20 meters apart. It's a whole different country. Why? Because its subculture tells itself different things. And when I hear sometimes people say, oh, well, the thing, it's all about staffing, we can't get people up. Another ward across from them, 20 meters away, with exactly same staffing, has got a different story to tell. So never underestimate the influence of microculture. And that's what my thinking in the whole campaign has been very much, how do we deal with the microculture issues? But that noted, it's also worth remembering this. Senior leaders set the tone. Managers carry the culture, but it is peers who drive and foster belonging. But we look up, we do, because, healthcare was born in the church and raised in the army. We look upwards to see the tone people set. And there's a person who got a knighthood as a CEO in the NHS. When they retired, and very, very lauded individual, when they retired, one person wrote, yeah, I remember about 8 or 9 years ago, I opened the door for this person and their other managers, and they didn't even acknowledge me. This person didn't even acknowledge I'd opened the door. You see, emotions, you can carry them for 50 years. And we've seen sometimes when people haven't seen each other, North Korea and South Korea, then siblings meeting up and they're both in tears because they last saw each other when they were teenagers, now in their 80s. The potency of the tone. It's, as Maya Angelou says, it's not what you said or what you did, it's how you made me feel. But when it comes to stuff, people want personal value and purpose from their work. When you go home, you don't just say, right, that's it, I'm going home out the door, and you kind of forget it. You think about it before you come in, you think about it and there are stories you are telling yourself. The last thing you should ever do to somebody is, can I see you tomorrow? Because what's going to happen? They're not going to be like, oh, at last, the recognition I've craved all this time. They're going to, oh my God, I'm in trouble. Because people tell themselves a story of, and it may be you're simply going to say, can I just check with the off duty? Was it that weekend you wanted or the other weekend? I just wanted to make double sure. Meanwhile, that person hasn't slept all night. That is what it does it. But when we have a personal value, when we are connected, I only half joke when I say to people, I was surrounded by classic Oxford Dons last night, literally. And we were having a bit of a joke about this because I would happily die at 12:30 on the day I retire because of our personal value. And I was with this philosopher and others, and they feel the same. This is the potency of all of these things. But remember this, people might hear your words, but what they'll do is they will feel your attitude. And something you could do with your poor old dog if you have one. I'm talking the canine variety. You could say, "Oh, doggy, you're the most stupid animal I've ever known. I absolutely hate you." The dog will be wagging away, thinking, "Oh my God, they love me, they love me." You see, they're hearing you, they're hearing your words, but actually they will feel your attitude because you could say, "You are the most beautiful dog I've ever seen, and I absolutely love you." What are they feeling? They're feeling your attitude. So it isn't about the words, it's how you come over. But remember, Senator Cory Booker, first African American senator from New Jersey, who says, "Hope is a conviction that despair will never have the last word." We're in an era of incredibly powerful storytelling for good and bad. We have three people, Musk, Zuckerberg, and Bezos, in case you're wondering, who are richer than the bottom 50% of Americans. And it would be easy to despair and say, well, that's just how it's going to be. That we just have to come to terms with that's how life will be. But actually, I think the way you go about it is push back even harder and never go in. I was in I would, I went to have a cup of coffee earlier in Blackwell's, as I do. And I was looking for a book by an Irish poet called Seamus O'Rourke. They don't have it. But instead, I found this book by Lem Sissay. Lem Sissay he's an Ethiopian British man. He got a CBE for services to literature and charity. He's an incredible poet, but he's done his brand new book called Let the Light In, Morning Poems. And I love this. He says, Meet me in the morning on the corner of night, where mist rises and hope's in sight." So you can convey so much in just 4 lines. You don't have to overthink your stories. You just have to believe in them. And if people believe what you believe, they will follow you. And then your perception will become your reality. So focus on the things you can control, explore what is possible, dream out loud. And remember, culture changing is a combination of hearts and heads and hands. It is about the connection to story. That's our why. But we need the strategy. We need the plans. That's the what and the how. And then, it's about, actually, I want to be part of it. How can I help? And that's the who. And always have an answer when you get that question. It might be the smallest little things, and political parties actually are really good at this. You can start handing out leaflets. It's a brilliant way of engaging people. But followers need clarity. If you're a leader without any followers, you're just a random off out for a walk. But what followers need is the clarity of purpose. That's your why. A clarity of plan, which is your how and your what. And your clarity of responsibility, which is your who. And with your team, sit down and say, why do we exist as a team? Funny enough, that's actually the hardest one to answer because you'll get the glib responses, but you need to give people permission to dig deep to their personal reasons, not go past their heads into the deep down. And it's amazing how many of us have stories of people when we were kids who were ill. Physio seems to be a thing. So many who, have had injuries as teenagers and what got inspired by great physios bringing them back to their function and decided actually that's what they wanted to do with their lives. And the purpose is digging into those spaces. And then it's okay, so what are we going to do? How are we going to do this service we offer and who can do it and do their parts? And I've put this slide up a few times because I think a lot about this stuff. But when I was prepping this talk, I remember realizing it isn't framing is just it's just a posh word for stories. And the old framing is we have falls prevention. But actually, a new story would be, no, we don't do falls prevention here. We do safer mobility. You see, people fall because they're not mobilizing. They don't fall because they aren't, or because they are, you know. Reducing length of stay, people is far too preoccupied, but actually what we'd really be doing is giving patients back their time. Instead of thinking about, and you can do this tomorrow, by the way, instead of talking about how many days has this person been in hospital, ask how many days have they been away from home so far? Instead of history taking, which feels so reductionist, actually what that person is doing is they're sharing their story, and our job is to hold space for that to happen. Not just about the hospital in the home, it's realizing there is no ward like home. It's challenging the assumption that there's hard to reach, difficult to reach patients and difficult to reach communities, when actually what facing is we are difficult to access services. That is not on them, that is on us. And when you hear the phrase, the plan is, why not reframe it as, let's plan together? A strengths-based, asset-based conversation rather than this is what we're thinking of. And instead of asking, let's see how you are tomorrow, push back and say, well, why couldn't they go home and why not today? And this story comes from Barnsley. I was in Barnsley in October. This idea. I got the hotel to give me one of these champagne buckets, big one. And I went around, there's 50 nurses and therapists and managers in the room. I said, could you drop your keys into this? And they were very cold, they're very lovely, and they did. And then I just put them on the table near, and I just carried on talking. And people I could tell were getting nervous, after a while. But if God forbid anything was you were going to work and tomorrow you'll go out the door, you'll pull your door, you might have a quick check of it, you'll drop your keys in your handbag, your man bag, or wherever it may be. You won't really give it a second thought. But if God forbid anything happened to you on the way to work and you get admitted, and they say, well, listen, we'll take the keys off you for safekeeping, and you're kind of going, yeah, well, I trust them, that's fine, yeah, it's no problem at all. And then you're stuck in hospital, and then you're stuck in hospital, and that hope that you getting home starts coming into, well, maybe they're not really well enough to get home. How would you feel when you look at your keys tomorrow or tonight? How would you feel if you never saw your front door again after tomorrow morning when you go to work? And that's a simple story. I have never had such a strong reaction to something I posted on LinkedIn. Even I just had a quick look at the NPJ Paralysis Facebook page that had a reach of nearly 2,000. Because the impressions and the numbers are not quite the same. But Will, my son who makes films of me, we've commissioned him. It'll be a very different one, but I've seen what he's done, and it'll be incredibly powerful. And we'll be launching it at our NPJ Paralysis deconditioning event on the 2nd of April. And if you don't mind me doing a quick aside, there's only 18 places left. But that story of the keys, and I think when I look at the Paddington Bear, and there's nothing planned in this picture. I just took a shot, and how much keys represent our agency and autonomy and freedom and choice, how much they represent 1,000 stories behind that front door of a person's life, and how quickly they become detritus, where we don't necessarily, as they go to perhaps a care home, that they don't even necessarily get to bring them with them. And that means to me, every single patient, unless it is a very strong clinical and incredibly dense CVA, they cannot stay at home. But otherwise, I think every person should have a chance to continue their story in their home. And the way to do so is we keep an eye on their keys for them. You see, we're addicted to story. And I love this definition. that even when the body goes to sleep, the mind stays up all night telling itself stories. It's great fun asking young children what they dreamt about. They are just mad. They're great. Oh my goodness, Yu-Gi-Oh! And all sorts for my son, and he was mad into Harry Potter. I loved it. And it's about those stories, you know. Hippocrates, he thought the soul went off on these fantastical adventures at night and came back into the body in the morning. That's what they thought back in Hippocratic times they did. It's how we connect. You know, I love the fact that in Aboriginal, First Nations Aboriginal people, we in the Western world, if I can use that lazy term, we look at the stars and make shapes, you know, the Dipper, the Plough, Saturn, Orion. But in First Nation Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, they don't look at the dots, they look at the darkness to make the shapes. What would Western civilization have been like if we weren't looking at the dots, but we were looking at the dark and creating the stories like they have of the emu, which as the world goes round and goes around the world, you know, it takes its orbit. The emu, the shape of the emu is like that. And when it gets to vertical in the springtime, then they can go hunting for the emu eggs. But they are natural environmentalists because there's always going to be one emu egg left so that the species can continue because they're seeing the story of the emu getting up. And that's the story and the power of those stories. And those stories that we connect. So the question to ask yourself is, what are the stories you tell yourself? Because I'll tell you all for free. If you spoke to yourself or to your friends the way you speak to yourself sometimes, you wouldn't have any. It's how we speak to ourselves. And when we are deconstructing our stories that we are telling ourselves is first, is that story true? Are they cross or did I just decide that they were cross? Does this story serve me that I keep telling myself? And actually, is it kind? Is it true? Does it serve me? Is it kind? And then what are the stories you need to tell? And then keep telling it. You will find what you seek subconsciously. How many of you have bought yourself a new car, got yourself a new car, never had that car before, and then you're seeing these cars all over the world. Everywhere you go, every street you find them. Why? Because your brain subconsciously is seeking them. If you tell yourself a story, my story is one of like finding humor in the moments. I have a ball in my head when I'm stuck in traffic and it says 20 miles an hour. I say, oh, that's a great aspiration. You know, so you could have a lovely time when you seek things because subconsciously, if you have a relationship where each one is coming home and telling me the other how awful the day was, it was a shocker, and you think you were shipwrecked. I got drowned last night. It was just shocking, and you're dumping on you, and actually everyone's unhappy. But if you were then looking each day for what good thing happened, and maybe take a photograph and pass it to your loved one, your brain will start looking for happiness. You will come and your loved one, when you get them, send her that photo, that text that, oh, you would not believe it's just so much fun. I saw a spider chasing another spider and they both lost. They got lost. Whatever madness. Me telling stories to myself now. But your partner feels your joy because you've shared the joy. And when you get home to each other, you see, that's how even relationships, long-standing stories in relationships can change when you seek what's good in each day. You see, remember this, all of us are memory makers and we may sometimes forget our patients. They never forget us. We make a memory every single day. And as I finish this, it's remember too that we should keep our feet on the ground to signify that nothing is beneath us. But we should also lift up our eyes and say that nothing is beyond us. The great, great, famous Seamus, the Irish poet and Nobel laureate. And I think there's so much in this. We can change stories, we can embed stories, we can change our worlds, because in order to change the world around us, we sometimes have to start with the world that's within us. So you're very welcome to take a photograph of this. Professor Linda Holt and I are building this up. But I would finish and say thank you for the generosity of your time. And I think this is my last January talk I'll be doing for Agile because my term finishes in September. So for all of you who are on, I just want to acknowledge the fantastic, incredible community that is Agile. It's been an absolute one of the greatest honors of my professional and personal life to serve as president of Agile.